could take us back a little bit to the, I guess, weeks or months preceding publication of the story when you're working on it. I mean, in film, they call it reveal, right? As the film moves on, it's kind of reveal details of the film. And so, I recall clearly reading the story and kind of imagining all of this kind of unfolding or revealing, ever more details and ever more scenarios. How did that work out for you when you were working on the story?
Well, it's an interesting case in that the reporting and the conception of the piece were happening sort of at the same time, and were in fact more or less the same project, which is to say, I'm mostly an editor, but to the extent that I'm a writer, I've always been interested in the kind of near future of science and technology, and keep an eye on, new academic research, and, sort of corners of the internet where, vanguard work is being done in both of those fields. And I have never been, or was not until a couple of years ago anyway, someone who is especially concerned about climate, but all these people who I was following and all these journals that I was reading and all of these websites that I was visiting seemed to be becoming more and more obsessed with climate change, and in particular, more and more concerned with the more extreme possibilities for kind of worst case scenario outcomes. And even in the quite pedigreed center of the road publications that I was reading in, say, Nature or Science, the accounts that were being given by quite esteemed scientists for what was possible, even just over the next couple of decades with climate change, seemed really discordant with what I was seeing in the pages of the New York Times, in the coverage on CNN and MSNBC, and not to disparage the climate work that those organizations are doing, but it seemed quite focused on the sort of optimistic half, and probably even the optimistic, I would say, quarter of the bell curve of possibilities. And it seemed like anyone with any real understanding of what of the science and all of the uncertainties involved, but also all of the inputs that we do know, and how they impact the ultimate climate outcomes for the planet, all of those people had a much more pessimistic view of where things were heading, which is not to say that the majority of these folks had, I ended up interviewing many of them at length and, on the phone in person, and sending a lot of them my material for review. But it's not to say that they all felt quite as apocalyptic as the article itself suggested was possible. And I should say, I'm not that apocalyptic either. I just thought that there was value in exploring the real extreme end of what was possible, in the same way that we think about car crashes when we design our automobiles, and we think about what kinds of financial crashes are possible when we're thinking about regulating new derivatives. It seemed important to me to think about the far end of that bell curve, and that's what I set out to do. And as I was doing that, really more and more research came to me than I was expecting. I mean, I was overwhelmed with how much work had been done in this spirit, and how vivid the portrait that it painted of a world really radically degraded by climate change, how vivid that portrait was, even coming through in the very dry language of academic research. And I felt similarly that there was a kind of narrative shortcoming in most of the mainstream coverage of climate, in that even when people did feel compelled to talk about disaster scenarios, it was often in quite careful language that was designed not to alarm the reader. And I felt, as someone who was becoming at the time much more concerned about climate change than I had been ever before, much more engaged in it as a political issue, and much more committed to it as a kind of defining challenge of our time, and it was doing that personally through alarm, was becoming more engaged, more focused on it because I was alarmed. I felt that there was great narrative value and great political organizing value in raising the alarm and telling the truth about what we know are possible, if unlikely, worst case scenarios, what we know are probable, if somewhat less harrowing, bad outcomes, and all of the terrible, devastating effects that will come to pass even if we hit our climate goals. I think one of the things that most people still don't really appreciate is that the Paris Accords, first of all, there's not a single major industrialized country on Earth who's on track to meet their commitments. But even if the whole world did catch up and honor those commitments, we'd still be in for really catastrophic climate disasters across the spectrum. And in fact, 2 degrees, which is the basic goal of Paris, was defined as the threshold of climate catastrophe not very long ago, just a couple of decades ago. So we're failing to meet the commitments that we have in place, but even if we honored those commitments, we'd be in for some really bad outcomes. And I just wanted to tell the story of what was possible. Again, both if we did everything that we say that we're going to do to meet the challenges of climate change, and if we didn't, because to me it seemed as though we were seeming less and less likely to actually hit those goals.
And you did tell the story, and I must say, as a person who reads everything that comes out on this subject, is as thorough. And the annotated version also, I think our viewers should know that there's the regular version of the story, and then the annotated version with the dozens and hundreds of studies and references that you came across. And so it's a priceless piece of work, and I think the world owes you a big debt of gratitude. And as I said in the email that led to this conversation, and everybody's celebrating Jim Hansen's very deserved 30-year anniversary of his congressional testimony. And so I wanted to mark this 1-year anniversary since the July 2017 publication of your story in New York Magazine. Now, you just said
I just want to say, I mean, as I'm sure you understand, I feel hugely humbled to even be mentioned in the context of that Jim Hansen anniversary. I mean, he is a godfather of this movement, a titan, a man of unbelievable integrity and wisdom and courage, and I stand in awe of him. I spoke with him for my piece, and he was hugely helpful to me, but well beyond that, I am completely in his debt, as we all are, for having raised the alarm when he did, and for continuing to courageously stick to that message, even when it's been politically and interpersonally difficult for him.
Oh, to this day, I think Hansen is a hero to all of us. And I'm sure when he sees this interview and reads the story, not only do I imagine him celebrating with us your 1-year anniversary of that story, but he'll be quite pleased to hear the whatever updates we can offer the world in this conversation. So, you mentioned some 10 reasons why, so far at least, it has become so difficult for people to comprehend it, to be able to wrap their arms around it, to kind of develop narratives to deal with this as the problem keeps getting worse. And I just want to run through real quick and just get your input on this a year later and see, today, what your take is on some of these items that you mentioned. So the language of scientific probabilities makes the scientists themselves, who are presumably the leading messengers of this, difficult to understand. The way they have to caution everything they say. Another is the uncertainty over the uncertainty. So there's so much uncertainty out there over this, and then there's uncertainty about there being uncertainty. And so, the default, that throws us into a default of the median. Instead of looking at those worst cases or the best cases, we kind of default to the median, and that carries some risks. The smallness of the numbers and the largeness of the numbers. So you have a fraction of movement and fluctuation in temperature produces or creates massive consequences. And yet you have, on the other hand, these large numbers of parts per million and carbon in the atmosphere and so forth. And that kind of throws people off. The abstractness of some of this, the overwhelmingness of the magnitude when we confront these various climate impacts and the possibilities moving forward. And it seems so overwhelming to so many people that there's a defense mechanism that kicks in and inhibits effective action. The thinking that any problem will eventually find a technological solution, like geoengineering and carbon capture and whatnot, and it's almost like this faith in the ability of people, of us, to kind of solve it at some point in the future without really knowing today how or having a clear path to that. We just have that faith that'll take care of itself. The culture of denialism, which you just mentioned earlier, is a part of the obstacle here, the culture of fear. You mentioned also in the story, you also contrast the speed of the change with the slowness of the change. The fact that for many of us, it seems it's moving so quickly. I just said that in a tweet yesterday. And yet to others, maybe to most people, it seems to be taking so long that we have time to deal with it. And finally, the assumption that climate will hit hardest elsewhere, not everywhere, and certainly not in your backyard, right? And so you run through, in a couple of paragraphs there, you just run through them, and I find that section in the article really compelling. And so today, how do you kind of address or approach those obstacles in the way? And have you seen any reason to feel better about some of this, or maybe worse about some of this?
Well, I would say that the main progress that's been made has been made by nature. I think that the extreme weather that we've seen over the last year has been astonishing. I mean, it's not just a departure from previous records, but worse than we would have anticipated, even given what we know about the climate, sort of outlier seasons. But those have been very valuable, I think, in opening people's eyes. I think that the string of hurricanes that proceeded through the Caribbean last summer, the incredible wildfire season in California last year and into this past winter, much of the flooding in South Asia, which wasn't covered nearly as much in America as the other two, and some other incidents like that have been so dramatic and so inescapable that I do think that on a few of those points, our sort of, diluted bubble of delusion has been punctured. I think that, the average, say, environmentally minded but middle of the road liberal now understands that climate change is not narrowly an issue of sea level rise. I think that we've begun to get comfortable with the idea that this is something that that touches all communities and affects at least weather systems everywhere in the world. And when you think about drought in particular and heat waves, you understand that those are weather effects that really stretch well beyond the coastline. I think also the quite dramatic news from the Arctic, which is not radically new this year, but over the last several years has been having an impact on, again, this sort of imaginary middle of the road environmentally minded liberal, which I was until quite recently. So I feel quite close to that worldview. I think that news from the Arctic has been startling too. I mean, the pace of melt that we've seen is well beyond what even the darkest doomsayers were predicting a few years ago. And, really does spell something quite disastrous in the medium term for coastlines. There have been many studies recently by quite staid outfits that are suggesting, hundreds of cities in the US featuring daily or semi-daily flooding by the middle of the century. That's just, climate suffering, climate challenge of a totally different scale than even, our sort of resilience warriors were planning for just 5 years ago. The landscape of what we need to be thinking about and planning for has changed really radically. And I do think that it's had some impact on the sort of middle of the road American. Some of the other issues remain as problematic as they were before. I think as dramatic as the extreme weather has been over the last year or so, I still think that most people do not appreciate how fast all of these changes are happening. We've now put more carbon into the atmosphere since Al Gore published his first book on climate than in the entire history of humanity before then. If you rewind to that time, to 1991, I think it was, there were signs that climate change was coming and that this would be problematic, but nothing that suggested that the planetary climate system was going to be destabilized at anything like the scale that it is turning out to be destabilized. And that is the result of what we've done industrially around the world just in those last 25 years. 25 years is not a long time. It's the length of the typical American mortgage. So when people are planning for their own homeowning futures, they're planning on a timescale, on the same timescale, which again is a timescale that has brought us from basic climate stability with some warnings about the future to a position of real immediate danger, to the brink of what until recently was considered complete climate catastrophe. And we've actually made quite little progress in addressing that. I mean, I've been more focused on the kind of emission side of things rather than the adaptation, mitigation, resilience side of things. But we're at peak emissions. It's not just that we're not drawing things down fast enough, we're growing. And the speed of our growth is growing. We've heard all of this fantastic news about the green energy revolution, which is incredible. The progress that has been made mostly by market forces to produce affordable green energy is another thing that's happening much faster than anybody anticipated, even the most optimistic observers. And yet, global share of energy, fossil fuels are actually bigger than they were 25 years ago. And if you think about that as a pie, not only are fossil fuels a bigger slice of that pie, the pie is much bigger because the world is using much more energy. So we've been, you were talking earlier about Jim Hanson's testimony and the 30-year anniversary. Those 30 years are often understood by people who are kind of lukewarm environmentalists, again, as I was until quite recently, as a period of inaction. But the story is actually much, much worse than that. Things are changing much faster in ways that the average person does not appreciate. And we are, degrading and deforming the climate system much more rapidly than I think anybody but the most dedicated observers of climate understand. That is that the speed, I think, is almost incomprehensible to people, and that remains, I think, a real issue in getting folks to respond at the timescale that's necessary. Another thing you mentioned is our sort of technological faith, and that's really important too, and I think has basically not been shaken. There's this really important study published a few weeks ago by this team of scientists at Harvard, backed by Bill Gates, about carbon capture, in which they showed a really dramatic reduction in the cost of extracting carbon from the atmosphere. And this was, as I said, it was a really important paper, but it was massively, massively overhyped in the media. The headline in The Atlantic was something like, which is a magazine whose climate coverage I really respect and admire, was something like, we may just have solved climate change. And the truth is, the scientists who were doing this work did not even build a technology for the extraction of carbon from the atmosphere. They were building a technology to produce fuel using carbon, which would then sort of could stabilize some of our electricity needs in ways that would allow us to use renewable energies more consistently, because one of the problems with many renewables is that we don't have good storage for them. But even pulling back from that, this dramatic price reduction in carbon capture that was described in this paper, which is, again, these scientists are doing amazing, important work, and we should celebrate them and push them forward. But the dramatic price reduction made it still the most expensive existing form of carbon capture that we have today. So there was news from the Academy that was celebrated across the mainstream media as a dramatic breakthrough that may even have made climate change an obsolete problem. And in fact, it was a very marginal improvement announced on the cost of a very expensive technology that has never been tested at anything like the scale that it would need to work at, and is still very, very far from being affordably priced. Now, again, we may look back on that news 20 years from now and think, wow, these guys really figured it out and it was really important. This breakthrough was a major, major breakthrough. But the sort of implicit complacency in looking at that news and almost declaring victory on this global problem, it's just, I mean, it's just so depressing. And this is work by people who know climate change. I mean, the people who are writing these articles are not novices. They're not tech geeks who are just, stumbled onto a climate story. They really know their stuff. And their instinct is to just celebrate the technological achievement and imagine a future in which all of our problems are solved by those technologies. And, I think that remains a real problem. We really do, as a culture, expect that any problem that is out there will ultimately be solved, probably by technology, and probably in ways that we don't imagine will cost us much. And I think both of those are delusions that we really need to rid ourselves of going forward.
Yeah, I think underlying everything you're saying, and in fact, this part of the article that we're going over now is really speaks to the cognitive dissonance that most people suffer from. It's part of the collective kind of condition when facing this issue, and it really cuts through many of these things that you mentioned in the article and you're talking about now. So, and again, it really, it's important. It's really vital for everybody in this space, whether you're in resilience or in science or in journalism reporting on this, that we're aware of these narratives and or the lack thereof, and how we need to really do a lot better in developing these new narratives across the board, which is something that you're doing in your own work. So. Now, I do want to run through, because really the heart of your story are these 7 or 8 scenarios, right? You run through, basically the message is, it's not just hurricanes, it's not just, sea level rise and whatnot. We have a multiplicity of climate impacts and climate changes to deal with that are coming at us fast, coming at us furious. And we just have to guard against all of them. And one of the things that I run into in interviewing and talking to resilience officers and resilience teams is their focus on those couple of things that they have to deal with generally in their own location. And it tends to really leave out some of these other climate changes and scenarios that will hit either them later on or elsewhere in the world, but affect them directly or indirectly. And so I just want to run through each one and then just kind of do a back and forth thing here. Let's say heat. You went through in the story the scenarios of rising temperatures and how that alone poses tremendous risks for all of us in the future. So a year later, anything to comment on in terms of heat? I just go through each one and just quickly, heat, food, plagues, and whatnot, and just get a year later update or thought of how you see it today.
Yeah, heat waves, heat stroke, heat death, those remain really important, dramatic threats. I haven't seen much to make me more sanguine about them. I think heat is one of the places where the article is most alarmist. And I think that if we are imagining a world that is, say, 4 degrees warmer, which is, I think, personally, I think about where we will end up, some of the most extreme heat outcomes that I describe will not come to pass. There won't be large parts of the world where you can't walk outside without dying. But if there are large parts of the world where throughout the summer, every year, there are lethal heat waves that are killing tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of people, even if those are sort of lesser disaster scenarios than one in which the tropics are completely uninhabitable, that's still obviously horrifying and harrowing, and we don't yet have any kind of technological or political solution for dealing with it. We have much of the population growth that's projected over the next century is in parts of the world where temperatures are highest, and those are the places where these impacts are going to be felt hardest, which connects to something that I didn't write much about in the article, but which is really important, and that is the extent to which all of these impacts, all of these cruel, devastating climate effects are going to be hitting communities, nations, continents even, who are least prepared to deal with them. The United States, for instance, Scandinavia, these are places that are wealthy enough that they have a lot more resilience built in than, say, the arid Middle East, parts of sub-Saharan Africa. And, as we watch this unfold over the coming decades, one of the major storylines will, I think, be this sort of climate apartheid, the way in which the wealthy of the world are relatively buffered from the impacts, and those who unfortunately live in poverty, global poverty, will really face the worst of it.
Well, we're already seeing that in the whole equity issue over climate change and resilience, and how important it is to really address that concern as a high priority. So some of the extended heat waves that you talk about and you reference will be a lot more challenging, very location based. So we'll see what kind of resilience innovation takes place between in the next several years to help people deal with that.
One thing I would just add is, before we move on, is just the most helpful source of resilience in the face of heat waves is social connections, community, and political support and infrastructure. These are not, there are technological aids that we can draw on, but the most important, actually, I think the most important thing that we can do in the face of heat stress and heat waves is to shore up our community support, political support, and infrastructure, so that the infirm can get the support that they need immediately, and that those who are suffering are not left to face the heat alone.
Yeah. In fact, that happens to be a solution across the board. I think it applies to about everything that we're going to be looking at. So, like, say, in fact, food, the next one, right? Food and droughts. And you mentioned in the article how within a few decades, it's already happening, but it's going to happen even worse. Droughts will be the norm in the areas that most produce food today, like the US, Australia, Europe, and whatnot. So all these food baskets will be pretty overwhelmed with this extended or permanent droughts in some cases. And so we really do have to figure out ways of feeding people so that between now and then we are resilient to that change as well. Any thoughts on a year later and how to build resilience in terms of food supplies and getting people nourished in the face of all of this?
Well, this is one of the areas that I'm most optimistic about, in the sense that I do see a lot of technological innovation, experimentation. I haven't seen a lot that gives me great hope concretely. It's not like there's one there's been one genetic breakthrough that makes wheat so much more productive than it was, 5 years ago. But since it does seem to be an enormous amount of work being done, I'm hopeful that will yield real progress. I think, people are very excited about vertical farms, indoor farms. I think those can be a part of the solution, to be sure. And I do think that sort of the genetic work will be really, really valuable. There was a major study sometime in the last 6 months about, I don't remember the exact details, but it didn't involve genetic modification. It may just have been particular targeted use of pesticides that allowed the grain yields in China to improve dramatically beyond what had been expected. Basically, all of these local farmers had been on their own in terms of best practices, and there was an effort to give them a kind of national tutorial about how to better manage their own yields, and the result was something like a 15 or 20% productivity boost, and that kind of boost is fantastic and will help offset whatever negative impact heat and drought will have on food yields. Yeah. On the other hand, there have been some distressing bits of news in the other direction. In the direct sort of heat effect side of things, I saw a report a few days ago, which I think was based on research that had come out a while before that, but that wheat yields in the U.S. are currently declining already at 3% per year. And this is, another thing like economic growth, which we'll get to, I imagine, where, 3% doesn't sound like much, but it adds up considerably over time. And we're not really in a dramatically reduced or sort of devastated situation when it comes to climate yet. We're just entering into that environment. So the fact that we're already seeing declines of that scale is really worrisome. And there's been a bunch of really interesting sort of out of left field work about the effects of atmospheric carbon in particular, on the nutritional content of a variety of foods, which show that many essential vitamins fall, their content in the vitamin content of food falls precipitously when there is considerably more carbon in the atmosphere. So much, again, these are impacts that we're already seeing in the food that we're harvesting, but we will see even more dramatically in the decades to come. And, we haven't even started, I think, really to think about resiliency in the face of that, because it's such new research.
Yeah, in fact, so much of this is a race against time, isn't it? Where you have, the trend ongoing and speeding up. And then you have these mostly companies and academia innovating solutions and trying to come up with things on time. And hopefully they will. And in the middle of that, then you have the resilience warriors kind of like figuring out how to deal with that and how to ensure food for their populations, especially in equity issues or less developed or low resource places around the world. I'm just going through these in the same sequence that you placed them in the article. So it's heat, food and droughts, plagues is next. You mentioned a couple of things. First, the release of ancient diseases as the ice melts and permafrost and some of these really ancient, frozen, mostly reserves or marine, the items that are under the ocean that start to become released with the changes to the oceans. But you also mentioned the migration and the mutation of current diseases and how that is spreading and sure to spread even faster. And so, where do you see plagues a year later, and any observations in terms of how to build resilience for that from a public health perspective in a city or in a country?
Well, I would say that the two last things are the most important ones. I mean, the frozen bacteria is scary and cinematic, and that's why I leaned on it, because it really gets people's attention. But I think ultimately, from a kind of global public health perspective, it's not that big a threat. The thing that is really worrisome is the spread of particularly tropical disease to parts of the world that have never dealt with them before. And on that front, I personally think that there's great opportunity in the genetic modification or perhaps even the eradication of mosquitoes. I know that there are a lot of people who think that it's quite concerning to mess with the world's ecosystem in such a dramatic way as to engineer the suicide of a species. But and I'm sure there would be if we went forward with that project, which is scientifically plausible at this point, given the gene drive technology we have. There would be disruptions that we can't anticipate for sure. But if we can, the mosquito is the main vector of many of these diseases. And if we could possibly eliminate it or at least curtail its growth, that would have a massive, massive impact on what kinds of public health crises we would see emerging. On the other hand, it's sort of the situation you were describing just a minute ago. These challenges are coming so fast, and responding to any one of them requires so much time, money, and focus. And on some level, the thing that scares me most are all of the public health impacts, all of the disease impacts that we haven't yet even anticipated. The Lyme disease has spread dramatically over the last decade. We know that is related to climate change. There was a really dramatic incident I was reading about recently of the complete death of the Saiga antelope in Mongolia because of, and this is the kind of thing that really scares me, because the uptick in local temperature triggered a transformation of a particular bacteria in the antelope's gut, which then became basically toxic, and they died en masse. Wow. Now, if you think about, there's been an enormous amount of research over the last decade or two into the complexity of the human microbiome. We are ourselves many, many millions of bacteria. We depend on those bacteria to survive. They play a role in our psychological well-being. They play a role in our digestive system most directly. But they're a hugely important part of the way that our bodies regulate themselves and stay healthy in the world. And if small changes in temperature can disrupt that system in even a marginal way, there are going to be public health impacts that we cannot possibly imagine now. The most dramatic being the kind of thing that happened to those antelope, that we could, a number of us could die from some bacteria we had been living peaceably with for many millennia. But there are also smaller impacts that could be quite crippling at a kind of social level. If, the relationship between, the health of that microbiome and depression, for instance, is something that researchers have done a lot of interesting work on over the last decade. And if depression spikes by 10%, that's really dramatic. That'll have a really dramatic impact on the way that we conduct ourselves in the world, possibly even on our politics and even on the way that we respond to something like climate change. But on the big picture, I just think, there's the mosquito, there are like the tropical diseases. We kind of know about those issues. We know they're going to be real. We have some tools at hand to deal with them. But there's a whole library of disease threats that we not only have we not started to think about, we don't even know enough to begin thinking about, because they would only emerge sort of out of nowhere. And those are the things that really worry me there.
Yeah, and then even I suppose kind of a bigger challenge than to resilience teams in cities around the world is how to anticipate those, and how to work with pharma companies and academia and researchers to kind of get ahead of the curve on that, and be ready when they happen, to the extent that we can anticipate them. So a lot of thinking, a lot of innovation, a lot of brain power needs to be applied to this because of that, because it's a really deadly and potentially really destructive outcomes that we have to somehow anticipate and be ready for, kind of turn on a dime and have some kind of infrastructure ready if and when it happens. So absolutely. Next is air. So you mentioned a couple of things there as well. You mentioned the carbon balance. As carbon rises and it kind of throws off the balance with oxygen that we have right now, that will produce some health issues and other disruptions as well. Plus a series of different types of smog, right? You have the ozone smog, you have of course, the regular industrial smog that is almost labeled Chinese smog, right? Given the worst case already happening in China on that front, the wildfire smoke, and to the extent that we have more wildfires around the world, then you have more populations exposed to that smoke, and that becomes a really serious air issue. So on that front, anything to offer a year later, any resilience, ideas on air quality?
Well, I would say that the Chinese track record has actually been really remarkable over the last few years when it comes to air quality and pollution. The response that they've put into practice in the aftermath of that 2013 air apocalypse has been really encouraging and shows that we can clean up the air from the most damaging pollution that we have if we devote the resources to it that are necessary. The worst place in the world now is no longer in China; it's in Delhi in India, and I think there will continue to be trouble spots that develop as industrialization processes unfold in parts of the developing world. But I think the experience of China shows that solutions here are possible. That's the positive side of things. The negative side of things is that the more that we learn about the health impacts of this pollution, the more horrifying it is. And I think it's conceivable that if we ultimately get to real aggressive climate action at the national level in the US and maybe even internationally, that it will be because of this particular question and will be the result of a rhetorical recalibration around very explicit public health needs related to air quality and air pollution, because the numbers here are so startling and dramatic and horrifying, and people intuitively understand what it means to have dirty air. Clean air is very easy to grasp. There was a study recently that I keep going back to again and again, measuring the difference in health outcomes globally between a world that was warmed by only 1.5 degrees Celsius versus a world that was 2 degrees Celsius warmer. And just between those two benchmarks, 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees, the authors calculated would be saved 150 million lives. So if we manage to,
from the air quality issue alone, just basically controlling for that?
Just from pollution. So, and this is, their optimistic spin was, well, if we manage to halt warming at 1.5 degrees, we will have saved 150 million lives. I think there's almost no chance that we get down to 1.5 degrees. I think there's basically no chance that we get to 2 degrees. But so from my perspective, this is like going from 1.5 degrees to 2 degrees, which we will inevitably do, will cost the world 150 million lives, which is, again, a number that's so big it's hard to process, but it's 25 Holocausts that we're just blithely, moving down that track. We're so far from averting 2 degrees of warming. We are on track at the moment for over 4 degrees of warming. Even if we put in all of the commitments to addressing emissions that we have on the books, we're going to get to 3.4 degrees of warming. That's still as far from this 2 degree goal as 2 degrees is from where we were as a planet 10 years ago. So these are, 2 degrees is a really, really unrealistic goal. And even that is going to cost us 150 million lives. And when you get higher, temperature gets higher, the carbon, the pollution costs are going to only grow. And so we're talking about inflicting very, very direct, very tangible, large scale death on huge portions of the globe, just through the air pollution associated with the burning of fossil fuels. Now, again, The Chinese example shows that like you can respond to this pollution. You can clean up the air. You can modify your factories' processes. If you are committed to doing that as a society, as a political economy, and invested in it, it is possible. The air in Beijing is quite breathable now, and it was not at all breathable not that long ago. But the cost of not doing that is, the more we learn about it, the higher that cost seems, and it's really encroaching on territory that I would call, morally unconscionable
Yeah.
to be not addressing.
Yeah, and of course that doesn't even cover the carbon imbalance. If we're just talking about pollution caused by industrial activity or economic activity, but the carbon balance is just the result of more carbon in the atmosphere, and how that throws off the chemical composition of air. I mean, that's as basic as that. So again, something to innovate for or about or on, something to certainly build resilience against. If you're in a city or if you're in a company and you got to invest in ways to protect your people against that as well. The next item is war and migration from conflicts around the world. Of course, famously talked about in terms of Syria and that conflict. But as you mentioned in your article a year ago, scientists are the first to say, "Hey, hold on. There are other places going through the same thing and not producing the same result." Should say other places going through the same climate impacts, or like, for example, drought, as in Syria, and that not leading to conflict. So conflict is a result of other more complicated chain of events, not uniquely attributable to climate, but climate is a factor. And so to the extent that that climate change and some of these, from plague to lack of food, to the heat, to the air, and other consequences produce conflict. Any thoughts on that a year later, or any ideas in terms of how to build resilience for that, other than moving to another place that is not suffering from a conflict situation?
Well, yeah, I
But
mean,
the migration also. I mean, obviously, the migration is a big deal, and it applies not just to war. I mean, I'm in Puerto Rico. We just had Maria come through here, and that led to 300,000 Puerto Ricans leaving to the States, and that has nothing to do with conflict or war. That's just a result of a climate disaster. But in terms of war provoked migration, that is likely to be as big, or perhaps even the biggest cause of mass migration as a result of climate change that we'll see. So again, any thoughts a year later?
well, the sort of war side of things, I think is really roughly where it was a year ago. I don't know of any work that has radically changed the view of the sort of conventional view of the academics working on it. Although I would say, well, those scientists are themselves hesitant to make a direct link between climate and conflict. I actually think that that's basically a semantic distinction, and I don't quite understand the political or intellectual value of doing it. I analogize it to hurricanes. We know that hurricanes are not singularly caused by climate change. They're caused by weather systems that were quite like the weather systems that existed well before climate change. We've had hurricanes forever. But if we have many more hurricanes, and if that is the result of climate change, we have to think of those hurricanes as being climate hurricanes. And similarly with war, obviously there are huge, huge numbers of contributing factors to any kind of conflict. There's the political stability of the region, there's the economic health and vitality of the region, there's any pre-existing ethnic or other sort of fault lines that underlay a particular society. And for, especially in the modern day, for any society to break into war requires an awful lot to fall apart. It is, not something that that happens all that frequently. But if climate makes those conflicts 10% more likely, then to me it makes perfect sense to talk about the conflicts that do emerge as being climate driven. Again, not to say it's the only factor. Of course, it's not the only factor. It's maybe in most cases a quite trivial factor. But if it's a contributing factor, it's really important to understand and treat as a contributing factor. The thing that I've been more focused on recently is just the question of migration as migration. That is not just away from war zones, but from drought and famine and political instability that doesn't result in conflict. All of these other ways that climate change will sort of cascade through our already weakened communities and societies. And the numbers there are just mind-blowing. I mean, a lot of these projections are totally speculative and, made by people who are sometimes invested in alarming the world. So we should all take them with a grain of salt, I suppose. But the UN predicts that we will have 200 million climate refugees by 2050. And there's 200 million. The Syrian conflict produced 2 million. So we're talking about 100 times as many refugees loosed upon the world as were loosed by that conflict, which, as I said in the article, has profoundly disturbed European politics and even geopolitics. And we're talking about a climate-driven impact that could be 100 times as high. I think it's the UN and maybe the World Bank says that it's possible that the number by 2050 would be 1 billion climate migrants, which is the total population of North America and South America. Now, obviously, that's at the very high end of the probability curve. It's quite unlikely to get that high. But the fact that it's conceivably possible is just, like as I said before, mind-blowing. And as we're seeing now, the world is not responding to the approach of these threats with a new spirit of generosity, accommodation, and open-heartedness. What you'd hope would be that the countries that are not dealing with climate-driven migration would be able to and invested in welcoming those who are, or those from countries that are. And we're really seeing the opposite, which is to say just about every country in the world that is in a position to help those in need, fleeing from one reason or another, from another country, are in fact closing their doors, electing representatives who are more hostile to migration and immigration than the previous generation, and enacting policies to discourage that flow of people. And that's really depressing. I mean, to put it lightly. We are entering into what could be a true migrant crisis over the next couple of decades. And the world is not only responding positively to it, it is running in the other direction.
And also, just the magnitude of the crisis will just force everyone to the table here and to really come up with another solution. I mean, because clearly, 100 million people, 50 million people, mostly North America and Europe, and I guess some of these Asian populations that will flock to Australia looking for some quality of life and so forth. And
Australia actually, I think, has been quite good on this.
Yeah. But so far, again, when we look at the magnitude of what's coming in migration, it'll really force almost a rethinking, a redesign of the entire process. And let's see what happens. I mean, we have islands that will need to move their entire populations over, and some right now, some of these Pacific islands right now, and Maldives and Tuvalu and whatnot are actually looking for land and to buy a piece of property somewhere so they could move 100,000, 300,000 people. It'll just the issue just force some kind of solution on the world, whether negotiated through the UN or bilaterally somehow, and we'll see what happens. The other kind of a dimension of that, and I don't know if your work has kind of touched on this, but more from the resilience perspective, the supply chains or supply lines, and how if you're a company or some kind of city or government or society or economy that relies on food, goods, material supplies from a region that is conflicted somehow, whether through war or some kind of climate impact, and you have that migration happening, how that will kind of intersect with the interruption of, food and supplies and whatnot. So it impacts people and just the humanity of that and the equity of that, but it also impacts, economic issues. And speaking of the economy, that's the next one, economic collapse. That's quite a daunting. They're all daunting, really, but this one, I guess it'll just creep up on people. When ministers and economic and business leaders and whatnot really start getting, bitten by just the loss of growth or the loss of economic activity or vitality or the erosion of some of this. And at some point, I don't know if what your take is on this in terms of hitting some kind of really cliff or off the table decline, as opposed to having it be a gradual kind of erosion of economic vitality. How do you see that a year later?
Well, I think the economic impacts, like the conflict impacts, are they're almost like a meta perspective, since they do draw on many of these other issues. The economic impacts are fueled by, say, changes to agriculture, also labor productivity, public health issues. Flooding is a major has a major economic impact, so there's sort of like best guesses as to how all of these things will add up and add up together, and what kind of aggregate impact we can expect. As for how the economic impacts will become visible, I think that there's a reasonable case that we're already seeing them. The researchers, the academics whose work I'm most reliant on here, have found that there's basically an optimal level, an optimal temperature for economic productivity, which is just about 13 degrees Celsius. And for every half degree above that, you get, when I'm forgetting the exact data, but in any event, I think that
I think I read you wrote in the article, it's a 1.2% decline in GDP for every 1 degree increase. But it's exponential, though. It's exponential. So it doesn't always, add up to that 1.2 for every 1 degree. It becomes a bigger decline in GDP as temperature grows,
and also as time goes on.
Right.
So yeah, but if we think about the U.S. has been historically at almost precisely that 13 degrees Celsius. So historically, we've been a country that is at the absolute optimal level of temperature for economic productivity. And we are now about 1 degree warmer. So by this math, that suggests that over the last several years, we have already deprived ourselves of a point or more of GDP growth every year. And this is interesting in part because there has been a lot of hand-wringing among economists about whether the kinds of growth that the United States experienced, especially in the post-war years, but then again in brief periods in the 80s and 90s, are possible now, or whether we have sort of renormalized to something where, say, 3% of growth is about our ceiling. And so it's possible that really what we are seeing is already the impacts of climate on economic growth, and that is why we have had a kind of subdued economic activity over the last decade or so. Projecting things forward, yeah, I mean, as time goes on and these losses accumulate, it's like compound interest in that way. The impacts are really, really quite dramatic. And, to talk about, for every degree you lose 1.2% of growth, that's, horrifying, terrifying enough, considering that, say, 2 or 3% of growth every year is sort of our best case scenario. On the other hand, it's a completely different scale of problem than if we're imagining by the end of the century, economic productivity overall as having fallen by as much as 30%, which is, that one of the major researchers whose work I was working off of, Marshall Burke, published a paper about a month ago in which he looked not at the extreme ends of the bell curve of possibility, but really what is likely if we don't change course on emissions. And that was the figure that he came to, that by 2100, we should be expecting to have 30% less economic activity than we have today. We have for several centuries become, especially in America, to a lesser extent the rest of the West, become not just accustomed to, but absolutely dependent on a steady rate of growth in the kind of mid-single digits. This is the basis of our culture that expects things to get better over time. And what these researchers are proposing is not just that we lose that possibility of growth, but that we go backwards quite dramatically, losing 30% of our economy. It is like, I don't know, exactly which state it would be the equivalent of, but it's like if suddenly California's economy was completely dead and the United States was that much smaller economically. That is the kind of impact that we're talking about. And that's where we're headed if we don't change course on emissions. This is, I think, really an underappreciated effect, and yet it is one that should be most graspable to the average American, because so much of our politics, so much of our culture is now conducted through the language of the economy and economic growth, that imagining a world in which we are not only not growing anymore, but going backwards, shrinking really radically, should be terrifying, I think, to people. And to the extent that we all wake up to that news, or to that threat, I should say, it may be a really important driver of action on climate, which all of the best economics work suggests. Aggressive action may cost something now, but even the decade or 2-decade timescale will pay off many times over by allowing us to avoid some of these worst economic impacts.
Yeah, it's the argument that it's a cost to the economy to solve climate change, but then the counter to that is that climate change is a bigger cost to the economy than the solutions to climate change. So, and again, this is,
those are not even comparable. I mean, if this research is right, and it is taken very seriously by a number of very, very serious people, it's not like some fringe theory. But if this research is right, the cost of even completely decarbonizing our economy is totally trivial compared to the positive economic impacts that would have at, again, a decade or 2-decade timescale, let alone the century timescale.
Yeah, and also the other kind of like really daunting thing to kind of like grasp here is that on the one hand you have these uncertainties in climate itself, right? The feedback loops, and what's going to happen to the plagues and the air and the food and whatnot and the heat. That's kind of like fraught with uncertainty. But then when you apply that to the economy and the possibilities and the complexities involved in this integrated global economy, and when something happens in India or in Europe, and the effect of that on the rest of the world, and so just really understanding and really grasping those scenarios, and because maybe this research does that for us, and maybe when they say 30% by the end of the century, that already kind of like factors in the scenarios in terms of air and sea level and plagues and heat and storms, and I guess we'd have to see, but from the perspective of a company or a city or a government or a community leader that has to kind of like prepare for this, how do they prepare for the decline of the economy pretty much endlessly? Because the other aspect of that is that because climate change is progressive and escalating, it's not like we're going to go back to normal growth after that 30% decline. I mean, maybe we'll stabilize at some point, but chances are it's going to continue to drop. The question is by how much, and how, what can you do in a city or a company to get ready for that, to prepare, to become resilient to that loss of tax revenue, to that loss of employment, to that shrinking of your economy. And, on the one hand, we have migration from some places kind of fleeing climate impacts. And on the other hand, we have, folks that just lose their jobs, and from the decline of the economy as a result of climate change. And it's a swirl of really complex intersectional, interdependent, cascading effects that somehow a city planner, a city manager, and a corporate executive has to prepare for. And
yeah, I think that's one of the reasons that the research on economic impacts is so valuable, is that
absolutely,
it is sort of a single metric that you can use to talk about how all of these things interact. It's a little more complicated to assess the impact because it's so complex, but assuming we can trust those models and those projections, it is a very easy to communicate single data point, single number, or single set of numbers to pass along, which is, I think, in this on this issue, really valuable.
Absolutely, absolutely. The last one is sea level and oceans, and you kind of combine the two. On the one hand, you have this is similar to almost similar to the air quality issue. So you have the poisoned oceans, and so you say the acidification and some of the bleaching, and then the rise of sea level and the impact of that. And so it's just, I guess, oceans. And what are your thoughts a year later on that front?
Things seem as bad or worse. I think that there were just some reports this week about what was called the Atlantification of the Arctic, that the Arctic, parts of the Arctic Sea are now becoming, in terms of temperature, in terms of chemical composition, in terms of the marine life that lives there, much more like the Atlantic. And we're actually on track to sort of lose the Arctic Sea as a ecosystem, which is a vital part of the way that the planet modulates its temperature. That's one of the major things that the ocean does, is it allows the planet to remain temperate and to sort of regulate itself, dealing with some extreme heat, some extreme cold, but basically evening things out so that the planet is livable. But really, the sort of biggest impact here is sea level. And in the article, I sort of underplayed it because I just sort of assumed that was actually one of the impacts that people were actually familiar with from the reporting, and I didn't want to dwell on it too much. But the news there has also been really, really bad. The Arctic ice sheets and the Antarctic ice sheets are disappearing much, much more quickly than anyone anticipated. The seas are therefore rising much faster than anybody had anticipated. And the most worrisome thing is that this is a kind of emerging academic field, the science of how these ice sheets break apart and when exactly they reach a tipping point that that they will be beyond recovery. It's all very up in the air. We don't understand the dynamics, the physics of how that happens very well. But our best understanding suggests that we are much more rapidly approaching those tipping points than we anticipated. Carbon we're emitting. But very soon we may be passing a tipping point with the melt of Arctic ice sheets, Antarctic ice sheets, where we are completely out of control of the melt. And we've already initiated a melt process that will unfold over centuries, but will flood much of the planet's Earth, planet's land.
And even the couple of meters that you say, or that the research indicates, as you say, that we may be looking at by the end of the century, means that, as some of these recent studies have indicated, that we'll be dealing with the consequences of that a lot sooner. So, as early as the 2030s, 2040s, a recent Department of Defense study on their coastal bases, right, and the need to relocate those bases inland or just get rid of them, suggested that even well before even 1 meter sea level rise, just a couple of feet, it just worsens storm surges, it just worsens flood conditions chronically along coasts. And so that is a pretty immediate scenario to build resilience against.
And some of those scenarios are afflicting places that we don't really haven't really even started to think about as being vulnerable. We all know about South Florida. We all know about the vulnerabilities there, but there was a major recent study that said that actually in the next 30 years, the biggest impact on sea level rise and coastal flooding will be, in the US anyway, will be in New Jersey, which will have almost twice as much of a cost to bear as Florida. And I'm being totally frank, that was the first time that, aside from Hurricane Sandy, that I had even heard about New Jersey as being a vulnerable location, let alone the most vulnerable in the entire US. So it's not just that impacts are happening much more quickly, it's that they're also happening in somewhat different places than we imagined, in part because the rate of the Arctic melt impacts the circulatory patterns of the oceans differently the faster that it happens. And so the sea level rise is happening faster along the US eastern seaboard and especially the mid-Atlantic coast than we anticipated, because our models didn't anticipate as much melt happening as quickly as it is.
Yeah, no, and the resilience challenge to that is really interesting. A lot of talk lately about, in fact, Norfolk, Virginia is actually huddling and meeting on retreating, relocating entire communities from the coast. The big Navy base there is already looking at relocation, and and so one of the things they're looking at is, well, should we buy those properties? Should the government buy those properties? Where does the government get that budget to just purchase billions of dollars worth of properties just to move people? Where do you move them to? You have to rebuild entire communities pretty much from scratch, inland, and the transportation systems and the health systems that go with that, and the whole infrastructure. So it's an entire redevelopment conversation that's going on, just starting on the resilience front, just to protect people, vulnerable to that sea level rise along the coast, etc. So it's a very big deal. I have been so abusive of your time. I just want to end with your end in the story toward the closing. You quote the Indian novelist, I'm reading his name here, Amitav Ghosh, from his book a couple years ago called The Great Derangement. And I found that really compelling, really, it just, captivated me anyway. And I know probably captivates everybody who reads the story and gets down to the bottom of the story. Ghosh in his book questions or asks whether, or really questions why the art community or just people in general, but mostly the novelists and the filmmakers and whatnot, have not been able to kind of like articulate adequately all of the above that we've been talking about, right? And so you basically say, or you quote him as saying that his answer is that we will probably not be able to do that, or the whole artistic community. You say because, and I quote, because the dilemmas and dramas of climate change are simply incompatible with the kinds of stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. So in other words, we just don't want to go there, basically. And then further down the story, you talk about scientists along the same vein, and why scientists are not able to kind of build an adequate narrative to this. And then, you say, and I quote you in the story, you say, quote, "We have not developed a religion of meaning around climate change that might comfort us or give us purpose in the face of possible annihilation, or let's just say in the face of these really catastrophic consequences. But climate scientists have a strange kind of faith, you say. They say that we will find a way to forestall radical warming because we must, because we have to. It's almost like they don't want to go there either. They don't want to go into that unthinkable zone, and therefore they just basically, do not develop the narratives, do not develop the what you call religion, right? Which is almost a metaphorical phrasing, not necessarily the God-based religion, but more the the narrative or the philosophy of dealing with these scenarios in a way that'll that'll facilitate that resilience, that'll allow us to act, to prepare effectively for what's coming. not to mention to the extent we still have time to solve the problem. So any thoughts on that, on from the artistic cultural perspective, from the scientific perspective, this mental block, this inability that we see nowadays? Of course, it goes back to what we started talking about, the cognitive dissonance, all those reasons why we just do not, deal effectively or develop an effective language to deal with this. But a year later, where are you at in terms of your observation on that, and what can you close with in terms of that kind of difficulty that we have as a human race?
Well, I think we're moving in that direction. I think the more people that are storytelling about climate in various forms, the better. And, in part because of the impact of my article, I've been having conversations with a number of people in Hollywood who are developing stories in one form or another that are adjacent to this sort of area of inquiry. So I do think that there is sort of coming down the pike, there will be a new generation of climate storytelling, and that will have some impact. But personally, I still feel like the best metaphor that we have for what we're going through is actually the theological one. We now have the responsibility to save the environment for our own species. We are holding the fate of the planet and all of humanity in our own hands. And that is a story of such a grand scale that it should be irresistible to any of us who encounter it. It's intimidating, but it is also, it gives so much purpose and clarity of mission. And, I'm not myself any kind of religious person, but I find it incredibly exhilarating, to be completely honest, that we are living at this moment when we are engaged in this incredibly dramatic, necessary project to save the planet for humanity. And, a lot of people, a lot of scientists in particular, are reluctant to use theological metaphor. But I do think that it's the best analogy that we have to what we're going through. And for, a century at least, we've had writers and intellectuals who lamented the loss of theological presence in our lives and the loss of meaning that real religion and religious guidance gave people. And I think we're seeing now that nature fills that vacuum, and we are now being sort of, I hate to sound like this is language that makes me so uncomfortable, but we're really being called forth to secure our own future in the face of our possible annihilation. And as I said to you earlier, I don't think annihilation is at all likely. I think we're almost certain to survive in some form, but we are facing some really, really catastrophic impacts. And the only thing stopping us from getting there is ourselves. So we have that responsibility, and we have the scale of that story to tell ourselves.
Thank you. And I look forward to reading everything else you write about this. So take care. Thank you.
Bye.